from the mother's point of view. How could I do this again? How could we do it again? It didn't seem possible.
On January 30th, Hollywood woke to a silence it did not expect. Catherine O'Hara, the unmistakable presence behind some of the most beloved characters in North American entertainment, had passed away quietly at her home in Los Angeles. There had been no long public battle, no dramatic statement, no final interview hinting at decline. One day, she was simply the Catherine O'Hara audiences felt they had known for decades. The next, she was gone, and the absence felt strangely abrupt. For more than 40 years, she made difficult work look effortless. Her timing, her wit, and her ability to turn small reactions into unforgettable moments made her a constant across generations of comedy and film. That is why the news felt so disorienting. There had been no visible warning, no public struggle, nothing that suggested anything was wrong, at least not from the outside. Then something unexpected happened. Her two sons, Matthew and Luke, stepped forward. Not to describe her final hours, not to sensationalize her passing. Instead, they chose to gently break a silence their mother had kept for years. They did not name the illness directly. They did not offer medical details, but they shared enough to change how people understood her final chapter. They spoke of years of quiet endurance. They mentioned signs she chose to keep to herself. They described how she continued working through projects on days when simply getting through the day required more effort than anyone realized. Their words carried both grief and relief, as if they had lived alongside a reality the public never saw and were finally ready to acknowledge it. Suddenly, the question shifted. What had Catherine O'Hara been carrying all this time? And why had she insisted on carrying it so privately? For most of her career, she was known as the performer who brought energy into every room she entered. What the public rarely considered was the pressure that comes with being a creative constant for decades. The industry expected reliability, warmth, and creativity from her without interruption. Even in her later years, when many performers slowed down, she was still offered major roles with the assumption she would deliver exactly as she always had. Professionally, she lived in an environment that rewards momentum, long shooting schedules, promotional obligations, travel, public appearances, the subtle but persistent fear of disappointing audiences who had grown up with her work. Catherine never spoke about this pressure publicly, but those close to her noticed how carefully she began structuring her time. She became increasingly selective with projects. She chose shorter commitments. She declined roles that required extended travel. These decisions didn't appear unusual for someone with her career. They looked like the natural choices of a veteran actress protecting her personal time. But behind those choices was something deeper, a growing need to conserve energy. There were personal losses she never discussed publicly. Longtime collaborators and friends from her early comedy years passed away. A few projects she had committed to were unexpectedly restructured, increasing her workload without warning. These moments affected her more than she showed. Each one subtly shifted how she approached both work and private life. The media, accustomed to Catherine's steady, polished presence, rarely questioned the small changes that began to appear. She canceled events with simple explanations. She stepped away from longer interviews. She limited her travel schedule. She avoided the publicity circuit when possible. Because she had always valued privacy, few people saw anything unusual in these decisions. But those working directly with her began noticing something else. On set, she remained warm, focused, and deeply professional. She delivered exactly what was needed when the cameras were rolling. But once filming paused, she often withdrew. She spent breaks alone or with a very small circle of trusted colleagues. She declined unnecessary rehearsals. She quietly avoided long social gatherings after filming wrapped. Her concentration sharpened. Her social presence softened. Some colleagues would later recall moments when she appeared tired in ways they had never seen before. Not dramatic fatigue, not visible illness, just a subtle heaviness that seemed to follow her between scenes. She never complained. She never asked for special treatment. She simply adjusted her pace without drawing attention to it. At award ceremonies, she occasionally appeared for only a short time before leaving early. During press tours, she limited the number of interviews she agreed to. She answered questions with the same wit and warmth audiences expected, but she kept interactions brief and controlled. To the outside world, she looked exactly the same. To those nearby, she was carefully managing something invisible. Her sons later described this period as one defined by quiet discipline. Their mother never framed her choices as limitations. She spoke about balance, about protecting her energy, about choosing projects that felt right rather than chasing everything offered. At home, she guarded her time more fiercely. Family came first, work fit around it. What no one outside the family understood was that this balance was not simply about lifestyle. It was about endurance. CatherineOHara did not want to be seen as someone struggling. She did not want her work to be viewed through the lens of sympathy. She wanted to be evaluated on the same terms she always had been, as a performer capable of delivering exactly what a role required. And so she carried on. She showed up. She prepared. She performed. And then, quietly, she stepped back to recover in ways few people noticed. By the time the public learned of her passing, those small adjustments made over years suddenly took on new meaning. What had once looked like simple personal choices began to resemble a pattern of quiet resilience. A performer who had spent decades bringing life and energy to audiences had, in her final years, been carefully rationing her own. Others who worked with CatherineOHara in her later years would later recall small moments that, at the time, didn't seem significant. She occasionally forgot minor details. She sometimes lost her train of thought mid-conversation, something unusual for a performer known for razor-sharp timing and mental precision. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together they suggested someone quietly managing more than anyone realized. To the public, she remained bright, witty, and fully in control. Behind the spotlight, however, a different story was forming, one made of subtle adjustments, unspoken challenges, and a resilience few people recognized while it was happening. Long before Hollywood knew her name, CatherineOHara had been shaped by a very different environment. She was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, in a large household where structure and responsibility were part of daily life. Her parents valued discipline, faith, and hard work. They were not wealthy, but they created a stable home where every child was expected to contribute. From an early age, Catherine understood the importance of reliability and self-sufficiency. She was observant more than outgoing. She learned to listen before speaking and to think before acting. These traits would later define her professional identity, but their origins were simple: a crowded home where patience and cooperation were essential. Her family emphasized modesty. Achievements were acknowledged, but never celebrated loudly. That upbringing stayed with her, even when her career placed her in the public eye. She rarely sought attention outside of her work. Even as fame grew, she treated it as something secondary rather than central to her life. Her early education took place in local Catholic schools where routine and expectations were clear. Catherine followed rules easily and earned a reputation as a steady, dependable student. Outside of school, she participated in church activities and small community productions. At the time, these weren't signs of ambition. They were simply things she enjoyed doing. During her teenage years, she gravitated toward performing arts more seriously. Toronto offered access to small theater groups and student-run productions, and she found them to be practical outlets for expression. Her interest developed gradually. She didn't talk about dreams of fame. She didn't describe herself as destined for the stage. She simply liked the work. She liked the process. She liked the discipline. Her family supported her involvement but remained realistic. Conversations often centered around stability, income, and traditional career paths. Catherine understood their concerns and carried that level-headed thinking with her. She continued exploring acting without assuming success would come easily. This mindset followed her throughout her life. The traits she developed in Toronto, independence, privacy, and restraint, became essential tools later on. Her ability to endure difficult situations without complaining, her instinct to avoid burdening others, her preference for handling personal struggles quietly. These were not behaviors learned in Hollywood. They were habits formed long before she entered the entertainment industry. Her rise did not happen suddenly. It began when she joined the Second City in Toronto, a well-known training ground for comedians and writers. She entered the group without fanfare or loud ambition. But her colleagues immediately noticed something distinctive about her. She processed material quickly. She adjusted her delivery without hesitation. She showed a level of control uncommon among newcomers. Her major breakthrough came with SCTV, the sketch show that would become a defining platform for her talent. Audiences saw a performer who could switch characters with precision and who understood comedic timing on a technical level. While others leaned into bold, exaggerated personas, Catherine relied on detail, small gestures, subtle reactions, careful pacing. That approach made her stand out even in a cast filled with strong personalities. The entertainment industry at the time was competitive, especially for women in comedy. Comparisons were constant, opportunities were limited, yet Catherine navigated this environment with the same quiet steadiness she had developed in Toronto. She didn't push for attention, she focused on the work. And over time, the work spoke for itself. Catherine faced a kind of pressure that rarely shows itself clearly. It wasn't just the challenge of keeping her place in a competitive industry. It was the expectation that she would evolve at the pace the industry demanded, adapt without hesitation, and remain consistently visible. Many of her peers responded to that pressure by aggressively promoting themselves, chasing opportunities, and keeping their names in constant circulation. Catherine did not. She maintained the same steady, disciplined professional approach she had always carried. In an environment that often rewarded self-promotion and visibility, that restraint sometimes placed her at a disadvantage. Early reviews, live performances, and television recordings helped shape her public identity. Critics described her as technically sharp and unusually adaptable. Producers saw her as dependable, someone who could be trusted to deliver consistent work without unnecessary complications. Those impressions followed her for the rest of her career. As she moved further into film and television, her reputation solidified. She was careful, meticulous, and disciplined. Directors frequently noted how prepared she was before arriving on set and how rarely she repeated mistakes. The structure she learned in childhood became an advantage in an industry known for unpredictability. But beneath that steady exterior, a contrast was slowly developing. With each major role, the attention around her intensified. Success brought opportunity, but it also brought expectation. Audiences wanted more characters, more performances, more appearances. The gap between Catherine's private self and her public persona began to widen. Early signs of strain appeared, though few people recognized them at the time. She quietly limited certain types of roles. She declined projects that required extended travel. She began choosing work that allowed flexibility and control over her schedule. At the time, these decisions seemed like normal adjustments for a seasoned performer. In hindsight, they reflected an early awareness of physical limits she had no interest in discussing. Her rise had been fast and precise. She had earned deep respect across the industry and established herself as a central figure in modern comedy. Yet the success that defined her career also created a foundation of pressure that would quietly shape her later years. As she moved into the final stages of her career, those changes became more noticeable to people paying close attention. She continued working, but her approach shifted. Long-term commitments became rare. She prioritized projects that allowed her to manage her time carefully. On paper, this looked like the natural evolution of a veteran performer choosing quality over quantity. In reality, it marked the beginning of a gradual retreat from the demands of the industry. Producers and casting directors noticed that she requested shorter shooting days. She preferred roles with less physical movement and fewer extended scenes. These adjustments were subtle enough that no one felt alarmed. Catherine presented them as practical decisions, and because of her long-standing professionalism, no one questioned her reasoning. Her public appearances declined. She attended fewer award ceremonies and avoided large gatherings unless necessary. When she did appear, she remained gracious and composed, but colleagues sometimes noticed small differences. She spoke more softly. She seemed briefly distracted at times. Nothing dramatic, just moments that stood out only in retrospect. Because Catherine had always been private, these changes didn't spark speculation. Her reserved nature shielded her from scrutiny. Friends noticed the strain more clearly. Dinners were canceled, reunions postponed, messages answered with brief apologies. When asked if she was well, she consistently reassured them. "I'm fine," she would say, keeping explanations short. Those close to her accepted this not because they lacked concern, but because they respected her boundaries. Catherine had always handled personal matters quietly, and they believed this was no different. The media noticed her absence from events she once attended regularly. Articles occasionally questioned whether she was simply becoming more selective with roles or easing into a slower phase of life. Without clear information, the public filled the gaps with reasonable assumptions. There were no rumors of crisis, only a subtle sense that something was changing in ways few people fully understood. Perhaps from the outside, it looked simple. Maybe she was spending more time with family. Maybe she was writing. Maybe she was choosing comfort over workload. Nothing publicly suggested a deeper issue because Catherine O'Hara maintained her silence with remarkable consistency. But inside her home, her sons Matthew and Luke noticed the changes more clearly. They saw her energy fluctuate from day to day. They noticed how she paused briefly before climbing stairs, how she ended conversations earlier in the evening, how some days she was alert and active while others seemed to drain her without explanation. They learned how to support her without asking questions she clearly did not want to answer. Over time, they found a quiet balance, being present without pushing. As months became years, the adjustments grew more noticeable. She declined roles that required travel or long days on location. She chose shorter appearances or voice work that could be done with less physical strain. She spent more time at home in Los Angeles, settling into predictable routines and quiet environments. Visitors described the atmosphere as peaceful, but unusually still. Then came what her sons later described only as a turning point. They did not detail the event. They only said it marked a moment when her health shifted in a way they could no longer ignore. From the outside, nothing appeared dramatic. She remained composed, functional, and warm. But inside the household, the tone changed. They encouraged her to rest more. This time, she accepted their help without resistance. The silence around her grew heavier. She stopped offering explanations for her fatigue. She spoke less about future projects. Instead of preparing for new work, she sometimes watched scenes from past performances. It wasn't sadness or fear that defined this period. It was quiet acceptance that her body required more care than she wanted to admit publicly. In her final months, Catherine lived with increasing discretion. She rarely left home except for necessary appointments. She stayed close to Matthew and Luke, valuing routine and stability. When colleagues reached out, she responded kindly but declined visits unless she felt strong enough. As January approached, she appeared calm, but noticeably slower. Conversations continued, but she rested more frequently. There were no dramatic incidents, no public alerts, no visible signs of crisis. Everything unfolded inside a home where she felt safe and understood. By January 30th, her retreat from public life was nearly complete. In the days after her passing, that long-held silence finally shifted. Matthew and Luke stepped forward, not with emotional speeches, but with clarity. They explained that their mother had lived for many years with a congenital heart condition. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't recent. It was something she had managed quietly long before anyone noticed changes. She followed medical guidance carefully. She adapted her lifestyle without allowing the condition to define her identity or work. She accepted roles only when she felt capable. She rested when necessary. She controlled her pace with discipline. Most of these adjustments went unnoticed because that is exactly how she wanted it. She did not want sympathy. She did not want people worrying. She wanted to be seen for her work, not her vulnerability. They respected her decision for years, even when keeping that silence became difficult. The change in her health was gradual. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden crisis. Instead, there were quiet months where she rested more often, spoke more softly, and chose to stay close to home. The responsibility to protect her privacy became something the whole family carried together. On January 30th, CatherineOHara passed away peacefully at her home in Los Angeles. According to her sons, the environment was calm and familiar, exactly as she wanted it. She was not in a hospital room. She was not under public scrutiny. She was surrounded by the people who understood her wishes and had helped her preserve them. Matthew and Luke chose to share the truth afterward, not to create shock, but to offer context. They wanted people to understand that her reduced public presence in recent years was not a loss of passion, but a matter of health. Her silence had been intentional. Her absence from major events had been protective, not dismissive. Their message was simple. Their mother lived with dignity, worked with discipline, and faced her condition with quiet resilience. Her passing marked the end of a remarkable career, but not the end of her influence. For more than 5 decades, she shaped characters that became cultural landmarks and delivered performances known for both precision and personality. Colleagues described her as steady, thoughtful, and deeply reliable. Directors trusted her instincts. Writers valued her restraint. Younger performers looked to her as an example of how to build a lasting career without spectacle. Her legacy extends beyond the screen. It rests in the discipline, privacy, and consistency she maintained throughout her life. The truth her sons shared did not rewrite her story. It clarified the quiet decisions that shaped her final years. And through that clarity, audiences can now view her later work with even deeper respect. Her performances remain, and through them, so does she.